Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Shamrocked here, and with this video I'm going to be going over the City of Threads dungeon with some quick Resto Shaman tips and tricks for each section and boss fight. I am trying out this new format to make the guide a little less overwhelming and easier to follow. Note, I will try to make more in-depth boss guides once the season starts. Let's start with the talents. There are a few key utility talents you should be taking for this dungeon. The Seasoned Winds talent will provide a lot of passive DR throughout the dungeon, as there are several mobs that have nature and shadow damage based interruptibles. The Spirit Walk talent will allow you to completely dispel the root on the last boss, making it far easier to position yourself during the fight. The Jetstream talent will allow you to use Wind Rush Totem to dispel the Rhyme Dagger Snare Dot off of the entire group during the second boss. And finally, Poison Cleansing Totem will help dispel a painful tank dot in the first trash area, as well as make for an easier time with the Venom Shell mini-boss later in the dungeon. Note that the Totemic Recall talent will allow you to get more use out of both Windrush and Poison Cleansing Totem mentioned previously. Part 1. First area and the Orator boss. The trash in the first area has 4 mobs of note. Swarm Guards, who will cast a large frontal aimed at a random player. Make sure to dodge this. They will also use their Swarm ability, which puts a painful dot on the entire group. Heal through this using your Surging Totem window as Totemic, or your Ancestors window as Farseer. Note that if you put a Cloudburst Totem down a few seconds after the Swarm ability goes off, that same Cloudburst can be recalled for a burst of healing during the next set of Swarm dots. Heralds, on the other hand, will chain cast a long cast time ability called Twisted Thoughts that needs to be interrupted as much as possible. If this cast goes off, it will target a random party member and put an expanding pool of area denial under their feet. This does considerable damage if the person does not move quickly enough. The Heralds will also put out a magic dot called Shadow of Doubt on a random player that does a lot of damage, especially if it goes out during the Swarm Guard Swarm ability. When dispelled, the dispelled player will shoot 5 orbs off in various directions that are telegraphed. If anyone gets hit by these orbs, they will take a large burst of damage and be stunned. Make sure you give the person who gets the dot enough time to move out of the group before dispelling, but don't wait too long or they will die from the dot damage. Finally, there are Silkbinders and Venom Blades. Silkbinders will cast standard bolts at people that hit for damage, as well as channel a cast that slows down players and ultimately stuns them if allowed to channel the full duration. Note that you can use Thunderous Pause and Jetstream to remove this snare and cancel the channel in lieu of an interrupt. Venom Blades will also put a poison dot on the tank that should be dispelled via Poison Cleansing Totem when available. The first boss is the Orator, a loud spider with some clear separation anxiety issues. Moving more than 10 yards away from this boss will cause him to pull you back in with a painful purple chain, meaning all players will need to navigate this boss fight while standing in a safe circle around the boss. Otherwise, this boss has a pretty predictable set of abilities to consider. The first ability is Subjugate. This is a tank buster that does a single hit of large damage to the tank and leaves a debuff on them that slows their movement speed considerably. The second ability for this boss is a narrow frontal called Terrorize that targets one random player. After initial targeting, this frontal will not move and so the player who's targeted can easily sidestep to avoid. Players hit by this frontal will likely die, but if they do manage to survive, they will be fear stunned in place for 4 seconds. The third ability is called Shadows of Doubt, and it is a magic dot that goes on 2 players. This is actually the same dot that the Heralds used in the previous area. Once this dot is dispelled or times out, the affected player will shoot 5 orbs off in set directions telegraphed by the player graphics. These orbs will do a modest amount of damage to anyone hit and will stun them for a few seconds. The fourth ability that this boss does is a channeled AoE called Vociferous Indoctrination, and it will happen to the entire group. At the time of this video, this ability does not do a lot of damage and should be healable using your standard kit or a small cooldown. And finally, once the channeled AoE damage is finished, the boss will drop a pool of area denial called Lingering Influence that will expand outward for a time before stopping. This area denial never disappears and can fill a room quite quickly if the tank does not use all of the space properly. Putting all of these abilities together, this boss fight is very scripted and each phase will be the exact same. The boss will start with the tank buster, into a frontal, into the dispel dots, into another frontal, into the group AoE damage, and then will drop area denial on the ground before repeating the entire sequence. The only dangerous part for this fight is the frontal that happens right after the dots go out. If a dot is dispelled right before, during, or immediately after the frontal appears, it is easy for someone to get stunned in the frontal and die. I found the best way to do this was to have the whole group spread out along the circular safe zone just before the dots come out. Then, once the dots are out, wait a second until after the frontal appears so everyone has time to readjust, then dispel one person while the second person times out. This should give everyone enough time to avoid both the frontal and the orbs. You can ping the person you are going to dispel first as well for extra awareness. The only other dangerous part of this boss is having the group move as a unit when the area denial comes out. Make sure you stick on your tank and keep them topped up as much as possible so they can focus more on movement and less on surviving the tank buster. If your DPS is good and your tank uses the boss arena space conservatively, you will kill this boss well before the room fills up. In terms of healing, this boss does not do a lot of damage, and so your standard Surging Totem or Ancestor windows should be enough to get through each of the phases. Use throughbit cooldowns for emergencies when somebody gets hit by an orb or when the tank is struggling to keep up with the tank buster. Spirit Link Totem is an invaluable tool for this fight for when somebody makes a mistake and is in danger of suddenly dying. Part 2. Second Area and Fangs of the Queen boss. This second area is very simple, if not slightly annoying due to its RNG nature. As a group, you will need to follow the perfume shades in order to find and kill 4 spies, called Eyes of the Queen, in order to activate the next boss. Keep in mind that this whole area is filled with patrols with large detection circles around them. Entering any of these detection zones will result in the player being thrown back to the beginning, which can be very detrimental to the dungeon timer. Take caution and go slow here in order to avoid making a costly mistake. Each Eye of the Queen spy has 2 major abilities. The first is Void Rush, which will put a painful dot on a few players that must be healed through. The second is Null Slam, where the eye will disappear for a short time and then reappear to slam the group in a telegraphed cone that must be dodged. Keep in mind that Void Rush can put multiple stacks of the dot on the same person if not enough people are in range, causing massive damage on that person unless a defensive is used. In addition to the eyes, there are some lesser mobs in each pack. The most dangerous ones are the casters, which must be interrupted as much as possible. An unlucky combination of Void Rush and a cast going off can result in a surprise death. The final eye will have the largest pack of mobs with them, and so extra care should be taken here. Use cooldowns as necessary, as there is quite a bit of RP between the last pack and the boss that will ensure most of your cooldowns will be up again by the time you need them. Thankfully, due to how the Void Rush abilities are spaced out, you should have a Surging Totem window or an Ancestor window to deal with every one. Cloudburst Totem is especially effective here, as the healing from one Void Rush window can be used to then do a burst of healing for the following set of Void Rushes. The second boss, the Fangs of the Queen, is a twin-style boss with a shared health pool. The bosses will take turns being empowered, resulting in a 2-phase boss with 1 intermission. The empowered boss will always focus on the tank, while the unempowered boss will focus on the DPS and the healer. For the first phase, while Nyx is empowered, the boss will target the tank with a large purple frontal. For every frontal this boss does, he will summon a shade that looks like a moving purple pool on the ground. Every subsequent frontal, all active shades will also do a frontal in a random direction that the group must dodge. During Nyx's empowerment, Vix will pepper the group with throwing knives. These daggers act kind of like the Void Rush ability that the Eyes of the Queen had in the previous area, and are just a painful dot that needs to be healed through. During the ultimate ability for this phase, Nyx will put out large purple circles on the ground that will explode after a few seconds, meaning all players should move out of them. After they explode, Vix will throw icicles at the entire group that will result in a large burst of damage with a lingering dispellable dot. This dot is also a snare, as it reduces movement speed by 30%. This is where the Jetstream talent comes into play, as you can use your Wind Rush totem to clear the dot off of anyone who is unable to clear it themselves or unable to get dispelled. Note that this dot does a lot of damage, so getting rid of it is top priority. For anyone who cannot get rid of their dot, they will require extra healing attention during the intermission. For the intermission, the Fangs of the Queen will each telegraph a large charge path, from which players have a second or so to move away from before they get caught in the charge. The bosses will charge about 3 times before going into the next phase, where one of them becomes empowered again. For Phase 2, while Vix is empowered, you no longer have to worry about the throwing knives on the group, as Vix will only target the tank. Instead, every so often the tank will get an ability used on them called Rhyme Dagger, which puts a debuff on them with 10 stacks that also shows up as a big white circle around the tank. Each player standing in this circle will remove a stack from the tank every 1 second, greatly reducing the damage that the tank takes from this ability. This means that during this phase, the group should stack on the tank and move as a unit. The second time the boss does this white circle, they will also use their ultimate ability. Nyx will put more big purple circles on the ground just like in phase 1 that need to be dodged by the group, all while doing pulsing AoE damage to the entire group. The key here is to move out of the purple circles as a unit, making sure to stay on top of the tank so that the Rhyme Dagger ability does not kill them from too many stacks. After the ultimate ability, the bosses will charge around again during another intermission and then will return to phase 1, at which point the boss becomes a rinse and repeat. As this boss does quite a bit of damage, make sure you are saving throughput cooldowns and defensives for the ultimate abilities. Specifically, the phase 1 ultimate ability appears to be more dangerous, especially for players who are going into the ultimate with the throwing knife dot already on them. This is a great spot for abilities like Healing Tide Totem or Ascendance. Just be sure to use Spirit Walker's Grace with Ascendance so that you can move while casting. Phase 2 is less dangerous as long as the group moves together, and the ultimate during this phase is the perfect opportunity to use Spirit Link Totem to keep both the tank and the DPS alive. And finally, note that because more and more shades come out each phase, there can be a staggering number of frontals to avoid towards the end of the fight. Make sure you watch your positioning and stay on your toes, ready to move at a moment's notice. Part 3. Third area and the Coagulation boss fight. This third area can be particularly dangerous for the tank, so have your Earthbind Totem ready to slow in case the tank needs to kite any enemies. If Spirit Link Totem is off of cooldown, have this ready too in case the tank needs a last second save. The first few packs here have Sureki Conscripts, which will put a stacking debuff on the tank that increases the damage that the tank takes. This can stack up to several times, essentially resulting in the tank taking 100% increased damage fairly quickly. Most tanks will have their own tools to deal with this, but make sure you are helping out by giving them extra HP percentage with Ancestral Vigor and Downpour. Spam heals into them as needed. While the tank is dealing with this, other mobs will either be throwing knives at random group members or casting random bolts, AoEs, and heals. Make sure casters get interrupted as needed and that group members are spot healed from the throwing knives. Eventually, you will make your way up to the mini-boss, Venom Shell. This mini-boss will do a frontal, just like the Swarm Guards in the first area. Additionally, he will occasionally put a poison-based dot on the entire group while also shooting green swirlies around the area that the group must dodge. Poison Totem is the perfect solution here. From my experience, you will never get more than 2 rounds of poison from this guy, so having Totemic Recall for Poison Cleansing Totem here will make this mini-boss super easy. The next area can be a little bit chaotic and very annoying if the Sureki Unnaturalers are allowed to get their Void Wave casts off. This is a 5-second cast that will knock back the entire group, and put a stacking dot on everyone. To make things worse, if anybody touches any of the webbed victims around the area, you will summon even more enemies that cast bolts and can very quickly add a lot of danger. If a Void Wave cast goes off, it is likely that some people will be knocked into these webbed victims, making the pull even more chaotic. There are also some big unstable test subject enemies here that will cycle between 2 abilities. One that puts purple swirlies on the ground and must be avoided, and another that does pulsing AoE damage to the entire group. Make sure you are preparing for these AoE damage windows using your own Surging Totem and Ancestors. You can also use cooldowns here if needed, as the upcoming boss is not too bad. However, try to save at least 2, such as Spirit Link or Healing Tide. The next boss, the Coagulation, is an easy boss if done correctly, but can quickly turn into a boss fight that adds a lot of unnecessary time to your dungeon timer if done incorrectly. Throughout the fight, the boss will summon orbs of black blood that will make their way towards the boss. If the boss touches any of these orbs, it will heal for a large amount. To prevent this, players must go around and catch all of these orbs as they come in. When coming into contact with an orb, a modest heal absorb shield will be put on the player and area denial will spawn underneath their feet. This area denial is hard to see and starts off very small, so it is important that players do not forget about it or they will quickly find themselves taking a lot of damage if they stay still after absorbing an orb. As a Resto Shaman, we have a pretty easy time with this fight. Just use your Master of the Elements ability to beef up your healing surges, and then healing surge players as they get their health absorb shields. Use your Surging Totem windows and Ancestor windows during the thick of each phase when most of the group has health absorb shields. During this, the boss will also use 3 abilities of note. The first, called Vicious Darkness, is an ability that will do a burst of damage to the group while knocking everyone back slightly. The second ability, called Blood Surge, will cause the boss to put a large puddle on the ground underneath it, and will do a huge burst of damage to anyone standing within the circle he telegraphs around him. And finally, as a sort of an intermission, the boss will channel a long pulsing AoE cast called Dark Pulse that does a ton of damage to all players. Thankfully, there will be no bloods to catch during this channel, so you can focus all of your efforts on healing. This is the perfect spot to use your larger throughput abilities, such as Spirit Link Totem or Healing Tide. This is also a nice place for Cloudburst Totem, as you can use the healing at the beginning of the channel to top everyone up towards the end. The boss will continue to cycle through all of these abilities until it is killed. Part 4. Final Area and ISO. Most groups at this point will go directly to the last boss room, where you will find 2 mini-bosses and the final boss. The 2 mini-bosses must both be killed before the final boss becomes active. The mini-bosses can be fought together, however, this is strongly advised against unless you are in a coordinated group who can practice the pull. The reason for this is that the mini-bosses will have overlapping abilities that will kill most players who are not prepared for it. Keep in mind as I explain these mini-bosses, the final boss will copy all of their main abilities. The first mini-boss, the Elder Shadeweaver, will cast bolts at random players that need to be interrupted as much as possible. The main ability to watch out for, however, is the Umbral Weave, which will put a root on all players. These roots need to be killed in order to free players and allow them to move again. The best way to handle this ability is to have all players stack on top of each other when it is coming out, so that the roots can be naturally cleaved down. As of the time of making this video, the Spirit Walk ability was not working on the root from the mini-boss. However, this is assumed to be a bug as it does work for the same root on the final boss. The second mini-boss, the Hulking Warshell, will cycle between 2 abilities. A Swarm ability that puts a dot on everyone, and a Tremor Slam that does a moderate burst of AoE damage to the entire group. Note that the Swarm dot is the same one that the Swarm guards used at the beginning of the dungeon. During this mini-boss, there is one moment where the Swarm and the Slam line up as a nasty overlap. Make sure that you save a defensive for this. Although the damage for these mini-bosses is tough, try your best to save your cooldowns for the final boss if you can. However, it is always better to use a cooldown and save the group rather than hold a cooldown and let the group die, so make sure you are doing whatever you can to keep everyone alive. Note that the final boss will spawn a few seconds after the second mini-boss dies, and it is easy to accidentally pull before everyone is ready. Make sure that you step back and take a drink if needed before starting the fight. This boss, Izo the Grand Splicer, is probably the most challenging in this dungeon, and is likely going to be considered one of the harder bosses for the entire season. There is a lot of damage going out frequently, while also requiring a lot of movement and group coordination. In a nutshell, the boss is going to summon orbs that will repeatedly be thrown where players are standing while she does her other abilities. The group will need to be mindful of this and dodge throughout the fight accordingly, as getting hit by one of these orbs will most likely kill you. I found that, if needed, make sure your DPS are standing away from you so that you are less likely to have to move and can instead focus on keeping the group alive. In addition to the orbs, the boss is going to cycle through 3 phases. For the first phase, she is going to cast the Splice ability on the group, which is basically just the Swarm ability from the mini-boss but with a different name. This is going to put a painful dot on all players. Immediately after the Splice ability, the boss will then use either the Weave ability or the Slam ability from the 2 mini-bosses we just fought. If she is using the Weave ability, the group should stack up together and quickly kill the roots that spawn. If not killed quickly enough, the orbs will kill people who are rooted as they will be unable to dodge them. If she is using the Slam ability, make sure you move far enough away from the boss to not get caught in the telegraphed circle around her. The difficulty here comes in keeping people topped up enough from the Splice ability so that they do not get killed off by the Slam or Weave abilities. As a totemic shaman, your surging totem windows should line up perfectly with the Splice ability, allowing you to easily keep up with the damage in every phase. You can also use cooldowns and Cloudburst Totem to ensure everyone has enough HP to survive the subsequent Weave and Slam casts. As a Farseer Shaman, however, your 2 Ancestor window will not line up perfectly every time, and therefore you will likely have to rely a bit more on your cooldown usage and may need to map it out a bit in order to keep up. After cycling through both the Slam and Weave abilities, the boss will then turn her focus to the tank and hit them with a 3-punch combo. Note that this combo has a large circular range around the tank, meaning anyone close to the tank while this happens will likely get caught in the circle and die. At this time, the group should move away from the tank and use this time to catch up and take a breath before the next AoE damage phase. And that's it. The boss will cycle through these 3 main sequences indefinitely until she is killed. Although this boss is difficult, once you get the rhythm down, it is easy to keep up. Note that the first time you see this boss might feel a little overwhelming, but this is a case where practice will make perfect. And that's it. Thank you for watching my guide on the City of Threads dungeon for the War Within. If you liked the format of this guide compared to some of my other dungeon guides I have done in the past, please let me know so that I can take the feedback into account while exploring future dungeon guides for this expansion. Thank you, and see you in the next video.